What happens when your greatest act of love becomes your biggest mistake? When the child you sacrificed everything for turns you into their personal servant? I'm Betty Miller, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cedar-lined walls of Willow Lake House still held the scent of my late husband's aftershave 3 years after his passing. Frank had built this place with his own hands, every beam and board a testament to 35 years of marriage and dreams we'd shared. The wraparound porch overlooked crystalline waters where loons called at dawn, and the stone fireplace had witnessed countless family gatherings filled with laughter and warmth. I never imagined I'd be standing in that very kitchen at 72 years old, scrubbing dishes that weren't mine while my 38-year-old daughter Meredith lounged on the deck with her friends, their wine glasses catching the afternoon sun. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman I'd raised to be independent and strong had somehow convinced me to sign over the deed to our family sanctuary, only to transform me into her live-in housekeeper. The decision had seemed so natural at the time. Meredith was going through a difficult divorce from her husband Marcus, fighting for custody of my twin grandsons, 8-year-old Connor and Caleb. She'd lost her marketing job during the company restructuring, and her world was crumbling around her. When she broke down crying in my living room 6 months ago, begging for a fresh start somewhere peaceful where the boys could heal, my maternal instincts kicked in without hesitation. "Mom, I just need time to get back on my feet," she'd sobbed, mascara streaking down her cheek. The lake house would be perfect for the boys. They love it there, and I could start my consulting business. "Please, I promise I'll take care of everything. You know how much that place means to our family." Frank had always said I had a soft heart, sometimes too soft for my own good. Looking at my daughter's tear-stained face, remembering how she used to catch fireflies in mason jars on summer evenings at the lake, I couldn't say no. The house sat empty most of the year anyway, and if it could provide sanctuary for my family during their darkest hour, what kind of mother would I be to refuse? The paperwork was surprisingly simple. Meredith had insisted on handling all the legal details herself, claiming she wanted to spare me the hassle. "I know a lawyer who specializes in family transfers," she'd assured me. "This way there won't be any tax complications, and you'll still be able to visit whenever you want. It's really just changing names on paper, Mom. Nothing else will change." But everything changed. The first month after the transfer, Meredith moved in with the boys and seemed to be thriving. She set up a home office in Frank's old study, painted the guest rooms in cheerful colors for Connor and Caleb, and even planted a small vegetable garden behind the house. When I called to check on them, her voice bubbled with optimism about client meetings and the boys' adjustment to their new school in Cedar Falls. "You should come stay for the weekend, Mom," she'd say. "The boys miss their grandmother, and I could use the company." Those early visits felt normal, comfortable even. I'd arrive Friday evening with groceries and home-baked cookies, spending Saturday morning teaching the boys to fish from the dock while Meredith caught up on work call. We'd grill dinner together on the back patio, and I'd tuck the twins into bed with stories about their grandfather's adventures in these very woods. The shift happened so gradually I barely noticed it at first. Small requests that seemed perfectly reasonable for a daughter to ask of her mother. "Mom, since you're already here, would you mind starting a load of laundry? I've got this important client call. Or could you watch the boys while I run to town? You know how they get when I drag them to boring errands." By the third month, my weekend visits had stretched into week-long stays. "The boys are doing so much better with you here, Mom. You have such a calming influence on them." Meredith would disappear for hours at a time, claiming business meetings or networking events, leaving me to maintain the household routine. Cook breakfast, pack school lunches, drive the boys to soccer practice, help with homework, prepare dinner, supervise bath time, read bedtime stories. The lake house that had once been my retreat became my full-time residence without any conscious decision on my part. My own small apartment in town sat gathering dust while I lived out of a suitcase in what used to be the guest room. When I mentioned going home to water my plants or check my mail, Meredith would look genuinely distressed. "But Mom, The boys need consistency right now. Their therapist says routine is crucial during family transitions. You wouldn't want to disrupt their healing process, would you? How do you argue with your child's psychological well-being? How do you prioritize your own needs when your grandchildren are struggling? The guilt was masterfully applied, though I don't think Meredith even realized she was manipulating me. In her mind, my presence solved all her problems: free childcare, housekeeping, and emotional support wrapped up in one convenient grandmother-shaped packet. The breaking point should have come when she started referring to household tasks as your responsibilities, should have come when she stopped asking and started assuming I'd handle everything domestic while she focused on rebuilding her career, should have come when friends stopped by to visit and she introduced me as my mother who helps out around here instead of the woman who owns this house. But I was caught in the web of my own making, trapped by love and guilt and the fear that setting boundaries might somehow harm my grandsons. Connor had stopped having nightmares about his parents' fights. Caleb was finally eating normally again after months of stress-related appetite loss. How could I risk their progress for my own comfort? The morning that changed everything started like any other. I woke at 6:30 to the sound of rain pattering against the bedroom window, pulled on my robe and padded to the kitchen to start coffee. The house was quiet, except for the gentle lapping of waves against the dock and the distant call of a great blue heron greeting the dawn. I loved these early moments before the day's demands began, when I could stand at the kitchen window with my steaming mug and remember Frank standing in this exact spot watching for the family of deer that came to drink at the water's edge. Sometimes I could feel his presence so strongly it took my breath away, his gentle voice reminding me that strength and kindness weren't mutually exclusive. The boys bounded downstairs at 7:15, still in their pajamas, hair sticking up at impossible angles. "Morning, Grandma Betty." Connor launched himself at my legs while Caleb made a beeline for the pantry, already negotiating for sugary cereal instead of the oatmeal I'd planned. "Pancakes?" Caleb asked hopefully, giving me the smile that melted my resolve every single time. 20 minutes later, I was flipping golden pancakes while the boys chattered about their upcoming science project on lake ecosystems. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself promising to help them collect water samples and identify pond creatures over the weekend. These moments of pure joy with my grandsons made all the exhaustion worthwhile. Meredith appeared at 8 o'clock, already dressed in a sharp business suit, scrolling through emails on her phone. "Morning," she mumbled without looking up. "Betty, the boys need their permission slips signed for the field trip. They're on the counter somewhere. Also, I'm having people over for dinner tonight, so we'll need something impressive. Maybe that salmon dish you make with the herb crust." "No. Please, no thank you." No acknowledgement that she was asking me to plan, shop for, and prepare a dinner party for her business associates. I'd become so accustomed to these casual commands that I simply nodded and added grocery store to my mental list of morning tasks. "How many people?" I asked, already calculating portions and timing. 8, maybe 10, I'll confirm later." She grabbed a piece of toast, kissed the boys' foreheads, and headed for the door. "Oh, and Betty, the Hendersons are coming by this afternoon to look at the dock repairs. Can you handle that?" "I'll be in meetings all day." The door closed behind her with a decisive click, leaving me standing in the kitchen with syrup-sticky plates and a growing sense of unease. When had I become Betty instead of Mom? When had my opinions stopped mattering in decisions about my own property? When had I become the hired help in the house my husband built with his own hands? The boys finished breakfast and raced upstairs to get ready for school, their voices echoing through the hallway as they argued over who got to use the bathroom first. I smiled despite my troubled thoughts, remembering similar mornings when Meredith was their age, equally loud and opinionated about everything from breakfast choices to sock colors. After loading the dishwasher and wiping down counters, I drove the boys to Cedar Falls Elementary, listening to their chatter about friends and teachers and weekend plans. At the school drop-off line, Connor turned to me with serious 8-year-old eyes. "Grandma Betty, are you okay? You seem sad lately. Children notice everything, even when adults think they're hiding their feelings perfectly. I forced a bright smile and ruffled his sandy hair. I'm fine, sweetheart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Just a little tired. Have a wonderful day at school. But as I watched them disappear through the school doors, backpacks bouncing with each step, I wondered what kind of example I was setting. Was I teaching them that love meant sacrificing your own needs for others? That family relationships should be one-sided? That women existed to serve without question or complaint? The grocery store trip stretched longer than usual as I wandered the aisles, mentally preparing a dinner that would impress Meredith's business contacts while staying within the budget she'd allocated. Funny how I'd gone from homeowner to household manager without ever discussing salary or benefits. The irony might have been amusing if it weren't so painfully real. Back at the house, I began the familiar routine of meal preparation, chopping vegetables and marinating salmon while keeping one eye on the clock. The Hendersons were due at 2 o'clock to discuss dock repairs, another responsibility that had somehow fallen to me, despite having no expertise in marine construction. The afternoon meeting went smoothly enough. Bill Henderson had worked on the original dock installation with Frank years ago, and his familiarity with the property's quirks made the conversation easier than I'd expected. As we walked the shoreline examining support posts and decking boards, he shared memories of working alongside my husband, their friendship built through shared projects and mutual respect. Frank was particular about every detail, Bill reminisced, running his hand along a weathered railing. Never cut corners, always used the best materials he could afford. This dock should last another 20 years with proper maintenance. He built everything to last, I agreed, watching a family of ducks paddle past in perfect formation. The house, the dock, even the tree swing. He said if something was worth doing, it was worth doing right. Bill nodded, then studied my face with the directness of someone who'd known me for decades. Betty, forgive me for asking, but are you doing all right? You seem different somehow. Tired, maybe. The kindness in his voice nearly undid me. When was the last time someone had asked about my well-being? When had I last felt seen as a person rather than a collection of useful services? I'm managing, I said, the automatic response that had become my default, just adjusting to some changes. He didn't push, but his concerned expression suggested he understood more than I'd actually said. After he left with promises to email a detailed repair estimate, I stood alone on the dock watching the sun reflect off the water in dancing patterns that hypnotized and soothed. This was my sanctuary, my connection to Frank and the life we'd built together. Yet somehow I'd become a stranger in my own home, a guest who stayed too long and worked too hard to justify her presence. The realization hit with startling clarity. I wasn't helping my daughter recover from her divorce, I was enabling her to avoid taking responsibility for her own life. The dinner party that evening unfolded exactly as I'd predicted. I spent 3 hours cooking, setting an elegant table with the good china, and ensuring every detail was perfect. Meredith's guests arrived promptly at 7, well-dressed professionals who complimented the beautiful lake house and delicious meal without any indication they knew who had actually prepared everything. I served each course with practiced efficiency, clearing plates and refilling wine glasses while remaining virtually invisible to the dinner conversation. Meredith held court at the head of the table, discussing market trends and business strategies with the confidence of someone completely in control of her environment. "This salmon is incredible," one guest commented. "You'll have to share the recipe." "It's a family secret," Meredith laughed, not mentioning that the family member in question was standing 3 feet away, hidden in plain sight. "I'm so glad you're enjoying it." As I retreated to the kitchen to prepare dessert, I caught fragments of conversation through the doorway. Meredith was describing her consulting business with enthusiasm, painting a picture of success and independence that bore little resemblance to the reality I witnessed daily. She spoke of work-life balance and setting boundaries, concepts that apparently applied only to her own circumstance. The evening finally ended after 10 o'clock with effusive thanks and promises to stay in touch for future business opportunities. I finished cleaning up while Meredith walked the last guests to their cars, my hands automatically going through the motions of washing dishes and storing leftovers. When she returned to the kitchen, Meredith was glowing with satisfaction. That went perfectly. I think the Morrison account is practically guaranteed now. You outdid yourself with dinner, Betty. Thank you. The casual gratitude felt like a pat on the head given to a well-trained pet. I hung up the dish towel and turned to face my daughter, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in months. She was beautiful, successful, charming when she wanted to be. She was also completely oblivious to the cost of her comfort. Meredith, I said quietly, we need to talk. Something in my tone made her look up from her phone, eyebrows raised in mild curiosity. Sure, what's up? This arrangement isn't working for me anymore. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us was quite ready to address. Meredith's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something that might have been panic. What do you mean? I thought everything was going great. The boys are thriving, my business is taking off, and you love spending time with your grandchildren. I do love spending time with them, I agreed, but I don't love being taken for granted. I don't love being treated like hired help in my own home. I don't love watching you build your life on my unpaid labor while I disappear into the back. Meredith stared at me as if I'd started speaking a foreign language. Mom, that's not what's happening here. We're family, we help each other. You know how much I appreciate everything you do. When was the last time you asked if I wanted to help instead of simply expecting it? When was the last time you considered my needs or preferences? When was the last time you treated me like your mother instead of your employee? The questions came pouring out, months of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. Meredith's face cycled through emotions, surprise, defensiveness, hurt, anger, as the reality of our dynamic became impossible to ignore. I can't believe you're saying this, she said, her voice rising. After everything I've been through, after losing my job and my marriage, you're going to attack me for needing support from my own mother. I'm not attacking you, Meredith. I'm trying to save both of us from a relationship that's become unhealthy. You need to learn to manage your own life, and I need to reclaim mine. So what are you saying? You want me to leave? You want to throw your own daughter and grandsons out on the street? The dramatic interpretation of my words was so typical of Meredith's conflict resolution style. Immediate escalation to the worst possible scenario, painting herself as the victim regardless of the actual circumstances. But this time, I refuse to be manipulated by emotional theatrics. I'm saying we need to establish boundaries and expectations that work for both of us. I'm saying you need to start contributing to this household instead of simply consuming everything I provide. I'm saying, I want to be your mother, not your servant. Tears welled in Meredith's eyes, and for a moment I wavered, my maternal instincts urging me to comfort and reassure, but Frank's voice echoed in my memory, reminding me that true love sometimes required difficult conversations and uncomfortable truth. Fine, Meredith said, her voice cold with wounded pride. If that's how you really feel, maybe it would be better if the boys and I found somewhere else to live. I obviously can't do anything right in your eyes. That's not what I said and you know it. But she was already storming out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the echoes of harsh words and the weight of decisions that couldn't be taken back. I stood in the silence of my empty kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a dinner party I'd worked all day to perfect, and wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life, or perhaps, for the first time in months, I'd finally made the right choice. The morning after my confrontation with Meredith arrived gray and drizzling, matching the heaviness that had settled in my chest overnight. I'd barely slept, replaying our argument, and questioning whether I'd been too harsh, too selfish, too demanding. The house felt different somehow, charged with unspoken tensions, and unresolved conflicts that seemed to seep into every corner. I found Meredith in the kitchen at dawn, already dressed for another day of business meetings, her face carefully composed into an expression of wounded dignity. She moved around the space with deliberate precision, making her coffee and gathering her things without acknowledging my presence. The silent treatment was a technique she'd perfected as a teenager, and apparently some habits never die. Good morning, I offered quietly, testing the water. She glanced up briefly, her eyes cool and distant. The boys will need lunch money today. I didn't have time to pack anything. The words were delivered without warmth, a simple transaction between landlord and tenant rather than mother and daughter. I nodded, accepting the implicit peace offering disguised as a household duty. Of course. What time will you be home? Late. I have 3 client meetings and a networking dinner. She paused at the door, her hand on the knob. Betty, I've been thinking about what you said last night. Maybe you're right. Maybe it would be better if we made some changes around here. The formal tone sent a chill down my spine. Betty, not Mom. Changes, not improvements. The careful word choices felt like warning shots across the bow of our relationship. After she left, I sat alone with my coffee, watching the rain create rivulets down the kitchen window. The silence that had once felt peaceful now seemed oppressive, heavy with the weight of unspoken resentments and shifting dynamics. I'd opened a door last night that couldn't be closed again, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. The boys came downstairs an hour later, their usual morning energy subdued by the tension they'd undoubtedly sensed between their mother and grandmother. Children are remarkably attuned to adult emotions, even when we think we're hiding them successfully. Is Mom mad at you, Grandma Betty? Connor asked over his cereal, his 8-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of the matter. We had a disagreement, I said carefully, not wanting to burden them with adult problems. Sometimes that happens, even between people who love each other. Caleb looked up from his toast, jam smeared across his chin. Are you going to make us move away? The question hit like a physical blow. These innocent children had already endured one major disruption to their lives through their parents' divorce. The last thing they needed was to feel insecure about their current stability. Nobody's moving anywhere, I assured them, though I wasn't entirely certain that was true. Your mom and I are just figuring some things out. You don't need to worry about anything except being wonderful boys. They seemed satisfied with this explanation, returning to their breakfast chatter about upcoming school events and weekend plans. But I noticed they both stayed closer to me than usual that morning, little hands reaching for mine more frequently, as if they sensed the ground shifting beneath our family foundation. After dropping them at school, I found myself driving aimlessly through Cedar Falls, a small town that had grown familiar over the past 6 months, past the hardware store where Frank used to buy supplies for his endless home improvement project, past the diner where we'd shared countless cups of coffee and slices of pie during weekend visits, past the library where I'd once dreamed of volunteering, before my time became completely consumed by household management. Without conscious decision, I turned into the parking lot of Maplewood Assisted Living, where my friend Dorothy had moved after her husband's death. We'd maintained our friendship through phone calls and occasional visits. But I realized with shame how long it had been since I'd made time for anyone outside my immediate family obligations. Dorothy's face lit up when she saw me in the lobby, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Betty Miller, what a wonderful surprise. I was just thinking about you yesterday. We settled into comfortable chairs in the sun-filled common room, surrounded by the gentle hum of other residents reading newspapers and playing card games. Dorothy looked content, relaxed in a way I envied. You look tired, dear, she observed with the bluntness of someone who'd earned the right to speak her mind. Everything all right at the lake house? The simple question opened floodgates I hadn't realized were straining to burst. I found myself pouring out the entire story, from the initial decision to transfer the deed through the gradual erosion of my autonomy, to last night's confrontation. Dorothy listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making sympathetic sounds. Oh, honey, she said, when I finished, reaching across to squeeze my hand. You've gotten yourself into quite a pickle, haven't you? I don't know what to do, I admitted. I love my daughter and my grandsons. But I feel like I'm disappearing, like I don't exist, except as a collection of services they need. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the wisdom of someone who'd navigated her own share of family complications. Can I tell you something that might help? When Harold died, my daughter Jennifer wanted me to come live with her family. Mom, she said, we have plenty of room, and you shouldn't be alone. It sounded reasonable, loving even. She paused, smoothing her skirt with hands that showed the careful manicure of someone who still took pride in her appearance. But I realized that what she really wanted was live-in childcare for my grandchildren and household help for herself. She saw my loneliness as an opportunity to solve her own problems. "What did you do?" I said no. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, disappointing my daughter when she was trying to help. But I knew that if I went there as the needy widow mother, I'd never be anything else. Instead, I moved here, where I have my own space and my own identity. Jennifer visits regularly now, and our relationship is better than it's been in years, because we're choosing to spend time together, not because either of us needs something from the other. The parallel to my situation was uncomfortably clear. But what about Meredith's divorce, her job loss, the boys' adjustment issues? How can I prioritize my own needs when they're struggling? Honey, you can't heal other people's lives by sacrificing your own. All you're doing is enabling them to avoid learning necessary life skills while you become increasingly resentful. That doesn't help anyone in the long run. Her words echoed conversations I'd had with Frank during our marriage. Times when his gentle wisdom had helped me see situations more clearly. He'd always believed that true love required honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. We talked for another hour, covering everything from practical considerations to emotional boundaries. By the time I left, I felt clearer about my situation, though no less conflicted about the choices ahead. The afternoon brought an unexpected visit. I was folding laundry in the living room when a sleek, black sedan pulled into the driveway. A woman in an expensive suit emerged, carrying a leather briefcase and moving with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to being in charge. She knocked firmly on the front door, and when I answered, she introduced herself as Patricia Kellerman, attorney at law. "I'm here to see Meredith Walsh regarding some property matters. Is she available?" "She's at work," I said, surprised by the formal visit. "Can I help you with something?" Patricia studied me with sharp eyes behind designer glasses. "Are you the previous owner of this property?" "I am. I'm also Meredith's mother, Betty Miller." Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "I see. Well, perhaps you can help me after all. I need to discuss some irregularities in the property transfer that occurred 6 months ago." My stomach dropped. "What kind of irregularities? May I come in? This is a rather complex matter that requires some explanation." We sat in the living room, Frank's favorite leather chair suddenly feeling like foreign territory, as Patricia opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Mrs. Miller, I'm going to ask you some questions about the property transfer, and I need you to answer as accurately as possible." "Of course. Did you voluntarily transfer ownership of this property to your daughter?" "Yes. She was going through a difficult divorce and needed a fresh start for herself and my grandsons." "Did you receive any monetary compensation for this transfer?" "No. It was a gift family arrangement." Patricia made notes on a legal pad, her expression neutral but somehow ominous. "Did you retain any legal rights to the property after the transfer?" "I thought so. Meredith said I would always be welcome here, that it was just changing names on paper for tax purposes." "Mrs. Miller, did you have independent legal representation during this transfer?" The question hung in the air, and suddenly I understood why Patricia looked so serious. "No, Meredith handled everything. She said her lawyer was taking care of all the details." Patricia closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Miller, I represent the mortgage company that holds the original loan on this property. We've recently discovered that the property transfer was completed without proper notification to the lender, which constitutes a violation of the mortgage terms." My blood turned to ice. "What does that mean?" "It means the mortgage is technically in default, and the lender has the right to demand immediate payment of the full balance. Approximately $240,000, the number hit like a physical blow. Frank and I had been steadily paying down the mortgage for years, but we'd refinanced several times for home improvements and never managed to eliminate it entirely. The monthly payments had been manageable on our combined retirement income, but a lump sum demand was impossible. "But Meredith owns the property now," I said weakly. "Surely she's responsible for the mortgage." "That's where things become complicated. The mortgage is still in your name, Mrs. Miller. Your daughter accepted ownership of the property but never assumed responsibility for the debt. Legally, you remain liable for the full amount." The room seemed to spin around me, How is that possible? Meredith's lawyer handled everything. Patricia's expression softened slightly. Miller, I'm afraid your daughter may not have been entirely honest with you about the legal arrangements. Based on the documents we've reviewed, this transfer was structured to give her maximum benefit while leaving you with maximum liability. Are you saying she deliberately deceived me? I'm saying the arrangements are heavily skewed in her favor in ways that suggest careful planning rather than oversight. The implications crashed over me in waves. Meredith hadn't just asked for help during a difficult time. She'd orchestrated a complex legal maneuver that stripped me of my home while leaving me responsible for its debts. The daughter I'd raised to be honest and ethical had systematically betrayed my trust. What are my options? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Limited, Patricia admitted. You could challenge the transfer in court, but that would be expensive and time-consuming with no guarantee of success. You could try to negotiate with the mortgage company for modified payment terms, but they're not obligated to agree. Or, you could convince your daughter to voluntarily transfer the property back to you or assume responsibility for the mortgage herself. The conversation with Meredith suddenly took on new meaning. Her cold demeanor this morning, her comment about making changes, her careful word choice. She knew this was coming. She'd known all along what the legal arrangements really meant. After Patricia left, I sat alone in the gathering dusk, watching shadows stretch across the lake. The water looked the same. The trees stood in their familiar positions. The dock Frank built still stretched into the water where we'd shared so many peaceful evenings. But everything had changed. I thought about Dorothy's words, about enabling and resentment, and the cost of avoiding difficult truths. I thought about Frank, who'd worked 2 jobs for years to make the mortgage payments on this place, because he believed in providing security for his family. I thought about Connor and Caleb, innocent casualties in a war they didn't understand. Most of all, I thought about the woman who'd raised Meredith, who'd taught her right from wrong, who'd believed that family meant supporting each other through difficult times. Where had that woman gone wrong? How had love and trust been twisted into manipulation and betrayal? When Meredith came home that evening, I was waiting in the kitchen with 2 cups of tea and a folder containing copies of the documents. Patricia had left. She took one look at my face and knew the game was up. I see you've talked to the mortgage company's lawyer, she said, settling into her chair with forced casualness. Did you know? I asked quietly. When you asked me to sign over the house, did you know what you were really doing? Meredith stared into her teacup, avoiding eye contact. I knew there might be some complications. Complications, I repeated the word, tasting its inadequacy. Is that what you call leaving your mother responsible for a $250,000 debt, while you enjoy the benefits of owning her home? Mom, you don't understand how desperate I was. Marcus was trying to take the boys. I had no job, no savings, no options. This house was my only chance at stability, and my stability, my financial security, my future. Did any of that matter to you? She finally looked up, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not shame or guilt, but calculation, cold assessment of her options and my reactions. You're 72 years old, Mom. How much future do you really need? This place would have been mine eventually anyway. I just needed it sooner. The casual cruelty of her words took my breath away. This wasn't the daughter I'd raised, the child who'd once brought me dandelions and declared them more beautiful than roses. This was a stranger wearing my daughter's face, someone capable of coldly planning her own mother's financial ruin. Get out, I said quietly. What? Get out of my house. Take your things, and your children, and leave, tonight. Meredith's composure cracked. You can't be serious. Where are we supposed to go? It's almost 9 o'clock. The boys are already in bed. You should have thought of that before you decided to commit fraud. It's not fraud, it's a family arrangement that got complicated. Mom, you're overreacting. I'm protecting myself from someone who's proven she can't be trusted. You have 1 hour to pack essentials. You can come back for the rest when I'm not here. You're making a huge mistake, Meredith said, her voice rising. You think you can just throw us out and everything will go back to the way it was? The mortgage company will foreclose anyway. You'll lose everything, and we'll all be homeless. At least this way, we could have worked something out. The only thing I'm losing is my illusions about who you really are. She stormed upstairs to wake the boys and pack bags, her footsteps heavy with anger and desperation. I heard confused voices, Connor and Caleb asking questions. Their mother couldn't answer honestly. My heart broke for them, innocent children caught in the aftermath of adult betrayal. 20 minutes later, they stood in the entryway with hastily packed suitcases, the boys clinging to their mother's hands with frightened eyes. Connor looked at me with confusion that would haunt my dreams. "Grandma Betty, why do we have to leave? Did we do something wrong?" I knelt down to his level, fighting back tears. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that are hard to understand. Your mommy is going to take care of you, and I'll always love you no matter what. But when will we see you again?" Caleb asked, his lower lip trembling. "Soon, I promised, though I had no idea if that was true." Meredith loaded the boys into her car without another word, her face set in lines of bitter resentment. As the taillights disappeared down the driveway, I stood alone on the porch Frank had built, listening to the loons call across water that reflected a crescent moon. For the first time in months, the house was truly mine again. Silent, empty, but I walked through rooms that still held the scent of my grandson's laughter, touching surfaces that remembered family dinners and holiday celebrations, and ordinary evenings, when love felt simple and uncomplicated. In Frank's study, I found the original mortgage documents in his filing cabinet, along with insurance papers and property deeds that traced our ownership back 20 years. Everything was meticulously organized, labeled in his careful handwriting, testament to a man who believed in taking responsibility for his obligations. I called Patricia Kellerman's emergency number, reaching her at home despite the late hour. "Mrs. Miller, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. My daughter and her children are gone," I said. "What happens now? That depends on what you want to happen. Do you want to fight for the property?" I looked around the study, seeing Frank's presence in every carefully chosen book, every framed photograph, every piece of furniture positioned exactly where he'd wanted it. This was our sanctuary, our monument to 35 years of marriage and partnership and shared dreams. "Yes," I said firmly, "I want my home back. It won't be easy, and it won't be cheap. Are you prepared for a long legal battle?" "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." After hanging up, I made myself a cup of tea, and sat in Frank's chair, watching moonlight dance across the lake. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and court filings, and financial complications that would challenge everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and personal strength. But tonight, for the first time in months, I was home, really truly home, and I was going to fight to keep it that way. The first night alone in the lake house stretched endlessly, punctuated by unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds that seemed amplified in the emptiness. I wandered from room to room like a ghost in my own home, touching surfaces that still held traces of my grandson's presence. Connor's astronomy book lay forgotten on the coffee table, bookmarked at a chapter about constellations. Caleb's favorite stuffed elephant sat abandoned on the couch, its worn fabric soft from years of bedtime comfort. By dawn, I'd made 3 pots of coffee and filled 2 legal pads with notes, questions, and half-formed plans. The morning light revealed the scope of reclaiming not just my property, but my entire life. Drawers had been rearranged to accommodate Meredith's preferences. My personal belongings had been moved to make room for her things. Even the refrigerator magnets had been reorganized according to some system that made sense only to her. Patricia Kellerman arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, her professional demeanor softened slightly by what might have been sympathy. She spread documents across the dining room table with methodical precision, creating a paper trail that mapped the complexity of my situation. "I've spent most of the night reviewing the mortgage company's position," she began, adjusting her glasses as she studied the paperwork. "The good news is that you have several legal avenues to explore. The bad news is that each one carries significant risks and costs." She outlined 3 potential strategies. First, I could challenge the property transfer in court, arguing that it was obtained through fraud or misrepresentation. This approach might restore my ownership, but would require proving that Meredith had deliberately deceived me about the legal implications. Second, I could negotiate directly with the mortgage company for modified payment terms, though they had no obligation to accommodate my situation. Third, I could attempt to force Meredith to either transfer the property back or assume the mortgage debt herself. What would you recommend? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the legal complexities. Honestly, I'd recommend starting with option 3. If your daughter is willing to cooperate, it could resolve everything quickly and relatively inexpensively. The other options could take months or years and cost tens of thousands in legal fees. I thought about Meredith's cold eyes when she'd calculated my remaining lifespan, her casual dismissal of my financial security. I don't think cooperation is likely, then we need to prepare for a fight. But first, let me ask you something personal. Are you absolutely certain you want to pursue this? Family litigation can be devastating, and there's no guarantee you'll win. The question forced me to examine my motivations beyond anger and betrayal. Was I fighting for justice, revenge, or simple survival? As I looked around the dining room where Frank and I had hosted countless family celebrations, where we'd played board games with our grandsons, and shared quiet anniversary dinners, I knew the answer. This house represents 35 years of my marriage, my financial security, and my future. More than that, it represents the difference between being a victim and being a survivor. Yes, I'm certain. Patricia nodded approvingly. Then let's get started. The next several hours involved detailed questioning about the circumstances surrounding the property transfer. Patricia took notes as I described Meredith's emotional state during her divorce, her requests for help, and the specific conversations we'd had about the legal arrangements. Every detail mattered, she explained, because proving fraud required demonstrating intent to deceive. Did your daughter ever explicitly state that you would retain ownership rights? Patricia asked. She said it was just changing names on paper for tax purposes, that I would always be welcome here, that nothing would really change. Did she provide you with copies of the legal documents before you signed them? No, she said her lawyer was handling everything, and that I didn't need to worry about the details. Did she encourage you to seek independent legal advice? She actively discouraged it, said it would just complicate things unnecessarily and cost money we didn't need to spend. Patricia's pen moved steadily across her legal pad, documenting what was beginning to look like a clear pattern of deception. Mrs. Miller, based on what you've told me, I believe we have a strong case for fraudulent misrepresentation. Your daughter made false statements about the nature of the transaction, concealed material facts about the mortgage implications, and prevented you from obtaining independent counsel. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by a deeper sadness. Pursuing this case meant publicly exposing my daughter's deception, destroying whatever remained of our relationship, and potentially affecting my grandson's financial security. The legal system might vindicate me, but victory would come at an enormous emotional cost. What about the boys? I asked. If we succeed in reversing the transfer, where does that leave them? That's not a legal question I can answer, Patricia said gently, but I can tell you that protecting yourself doesn't make you responsible for solving everyone else's problems. Your daughter is an adult who made deliberate choices. The consequences of those choices belong to her, not to you. After Patricia left, I sat alone with a stack of legal documents and a growing sense of determination. Frank's voice seemed to whisper from every corner of the house, reminding me of conversations we'd had about standing up for ourselves, about the difference between kindness and weakness. He'd faced his own difficult family situations over the years, always with quiet dignity and unwavering principles. The phone rang just after noon. Meredith's number appeared on the caller ID, and I hesitated before answering. Part of me hoped she was calling to apologize, to offer some explanation that would make sense of her actions. A larger part knew better. Mom? Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the underlying panic. We need to talk. I don't think there's anything left to discuss. Please, just listen for a minute. I know you're upset, and I understand why. Maybe I should have explained things better from the beginning. But kicking us out last night was extreme. The boys are traumatized. The manipulation was subtle but unmistakable. Blame me for being upset rather than addressing her deception. Make my reaction the problem rather than her actions. Use the children as emotional leverage. Where are you staying? I asked, genuinely concerned for my grandsons. Despite everything. A motel for now. But Mom, we can't afford this long term. My business is just getting started. And the legal fees from the divorce cleaned out my savings. That's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to solve. How can you say that? We're your family. Those are your grandsons who are sleeping on motel beds, because their grandmother threw them out of their home. The guilt was expertly applied, targeting every maternal instinct I possessed. But Dorothy's words echoed in my memory, reminding me that enabling wasn't helping anyone in the long run. Meredith, I know about the mortgage situation. I know that you transferred ownership while leaving me responsible for the debt. I know this wasn't an oversight or a misunderstanding. The silence stretched long enough for me to wonder if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its persuasive warmth. Who told you that? Does it matter? The question is what you're going to do about it. What do you mean? I mean you have a choice. You can voluntarily transfer the property back to me, or you can assume responsibility for the mortgage yourself. Either way, this situation gets resolved. That's ridiculous. I can't qualify for a mortgage in my current financial situation, and I'm not giving up the only stability my children have. Then you should have thought of that before you committed fraud. It wasn't fraud. It was a family arrangement that you're now trying to destroy because you can't stand seeing me succeed. The accusation was so far from reality that I almost laughed. Meredith, succeeding by destroying your mother's financial security isn't success, it's theft. Fine, she said, her voice turning cold again. If that's how you want to play this, then we'll see who wins. But don't expect me to make this easy for you. And don't expect to ever see Connor and Caleb again. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone with a mixture of heartbreak and resolve. She'd just threatened to use my grandsons as weapons in our legal battle, confirming that the daughter I'd raised had been replaced by someone I no longer recognized. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. I was reviewing financial documents when a car pulled into the driveway, and my neighbor Jake Hartwell emerged carrying a covered casserole dish. Jake and his wife Maria lived in the small cabin next door, and we'd maintained a friendly relationship over the years despite only seeing each other seasonally. Betty, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, he said when I opened the door. Maria sent this over when we heard about the family troubles. Sometimes food helps when words don't. I invited him in, grateful for the kindness of neighbors who owed me nothing but offered support anyway. Jake was a retired police officer with 25 years of experience dealing with family disputes, and his calm presence was exactly what I needed. Word travels fast in a small community, he said, settling into a kitchen chair. Some folks saw the argument last night. The car's leaving late. Want to talk about it? I found myself sharing the basic outline of my situation, carefully avoiding details that might bias any future legal proceedings. Jake listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that suggested he understood the complexities involved. Family disputes are the worst kind, he said finally, because there's no such thing as winning. Somebody always loses more than they can afford. So you think I should just let it go, accept the situation and move on? Hell no, he said with surprising vehemence. I think you should fight for what's yours, but I also think you should be prepared for the long haul. These things have a way of getting uglier before they get better. We talked for another hour, covering everything from home security during the legal proceedings to the practical challenges of living alone at my age. Jake offered to check on the house when I needed to be away, and Maria apparently wanted to include me in their weekly dinner rotation. The kindness of relative strangers stood in stark contrast to my daughter's betrayal. That evening I called my sister Ruth in Phoenix, needing to hear the voice of someone who'd known me long before I became a mother and grandmother. Ruth was 3 years older and had always possessed a clarity about people and situations that I envied. I wondered when you'd call, she said after I'd explained everything. I've been worried about you since Meredith moved in. Something about the whole arrangement didn't sit right with me. Why didn't you say anything? Would you have listened? You were so focused on helping your daughter that you couldn't see what was really happening. Sometimes we have to learn these lessons the hard way. Ruth's perspective was brutally honest, but ultimately supportive. She'd dealt with her own share of family manipulation over the years and had learned to recognize the patterns. The thing about people like Meredith, she said, is that they're experts at making their problems everyone else's responsibility. They create crises and then demand that others sacrifice to solve them. It's a pattern that only gets worse if you enable it. But what about the boys? They didn't choose any of this. No, they did. But you rescuing them from the consequences of their mother's actions doesn't help them in the long run either. They need to see that actions have consequences, that adults are responsible for their own choices. We talked until nearly midnight, Ruth's wisdom providing the perspective I desperately needed. She'd offered to loan me money for legal expenses if necessary, and the knowledge that I wasn't completely alone in this fight gave me strength I hadn't realized I'd lost. The next morning brought a certified letter from Meredith's attorney, a different lawyer than the one who'd supposedly handled the original property transfer. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, threatening countersuits for harassment and emotional distress if I proceeded with my frivolous claims. I forwarded the letter to Patricia, who called me within an hour. "Well, this confirms that your daughter is taking the situation seriously," she said. "The tone is aggressive, but the substance is weak. They're hoping to scare you into backing down. Will it work? That depends on you. Are you scared?" I thought about Frank, who'd served in Vietnam and never talked about the things that had frightened him, but had faced them anyway. I thought about the generations of women in my family who'd survived wars and depressions and personal tragedies by refusing to give up. I thought about the choice between being a victim and being a fighter. "I'm terrified," I said honestly, "but I'm not backing down." "Good. Then let's give them something to really worry about." The next several days were consumed by legal preparation. Patricia arranged for an independent appraisal of the property to establish its current value. She requested copies of all documents related to the original transfer, including communications between Meredith and her attorney. She began preparing a formal complaint that would initiate court proceedings if Meredith continued to refuse cooperation. Meanwhile, I started the difficult process of reclaiming my own life. I spent hours sorting through belongings that had been displaced or rearranged, gradually restoring the house to the way Frank and I had maintained it. Each recovered photograph, each relocated book, each repositioned piece of furniture felt like a small victory in the larger battle for my identity. The physical work was therapeutic, but the emotional toll was enormous. Every day brought reminders of my grandson's absence. Connor's astronomy charts on the refrigerator, Caleb's art projects still hanging in the hallway, the silence where their laughter used to echo through the rooms. I found myself questioning every decision I'd made as a mother. Had I been too permissive, too generous, too trusting? Had I somehow failed to teach Meredith the values Frank and I had tried to instill? The self-doubt was consuming, threatening to undermine my resolve when I needed it most. It was during one of these dark moments that I discovered Frank's letter. I was cleaning out his desk drawer, looking for insurance documents Patricia had requested, when my fingers found an envelope tucked behind the filing folder. My name was written across the front in Frank's careful handwriting, along with a date from 2 years ago, just months before his heart attack. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with his familiar script: "My dearest Betty, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're facing the world without me. I know how strong you are, even when you don't believe it yourself. I know how much you love our family, sometimes more than you love yourself, but I also know that love without boundaries isn't really love at all, it's just enabling. If Meredith ever takes advantage of your generous heart, don't let guilt keep you from protecting yourself. You taught her right from wrong. If she chooses wrong, that's her responsibility, not yours. Be strong, be smart, and remember that I'll always be proud of the woman you are. All my love, Frank." I read the letter 3 times before the tears came, great heaving sobs that seemed to originate from some deep well of grief I'd been avoiding since his death. Frank had known, somehow he'd understood the challenges I would face, and had tried to leave me the strength to meet them. When the crying finally stopped, I felt clearer than I had in months. Frank's words had given me permission to fight for myself without guilt, to love my family without sacrificing my own well-being. The letter was a gift across time, a reminder of who I was beyond my roles as mother and grandmother. I called Patricia immediately. "I want to file the lawsuit," I said. Today, if possible. Are you sure? Once we file, there's no going back. This becomes a matter of public record. I'm sure. My husband left me a letter, and it reminded me of something important. Sometimes love means saying no, sometimes protecting yourself is the most loving thing you can do. All right then, let's go to war. The formal complaint was filed that afternoon, alleging fraudulent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, and unjust enrichment. The local newspaper would undoubtedly pick up the story within days, making our family dispute a matter of public interest. The thought of strangers reading about our private pain was humiliating, but the alternative was worse. That evening, I sat on the porch watching the sun set over the lake, Frank's letter folded carefully in my pocket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new complications, new opportunities for doubt and regret, but tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in the home my husband had built, fighting for the life we'd created together, honoring the love that had made me strong enough to stand alone when necessary. The loons called across the water as darkness settled over the lake, their voices wild and free, and unafraid. I understood that feeling now. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid either. The courthouse steps were slick with morning frost when I arrived for our first hearing, my hands trembling from cold and nerves, as Patricia guided me through the imposing glass door. The building hummed with activity, lawyers in expensive suits hurrying past with briefcases and determined expressions, their heels clicking against marble floors worn smooth by decades of legal battle. Judge Marilyn Hendricks presided over the preliminary hearing with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every variety of family dispute imaginable. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her piercing blue eyes missed nothing as she reviewed the case document. When she looked up, her gaze swept the courtroom with clinical precision. "This is a property dispute between family members," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I want to establish some ground rules before we proceed. This courtroom will not become a venue for airing personal grievances or family drama. We're here to determine legal facts and render appropriate judgment based on the law." Meredith sat at the defendant's table with her attorney, Marcus Whitfield, a thin man with prematurely gray hair and the sharp-eyed look of someone who specialized in finding loopholes. She wore a navy blue suit that projected professional competence, her makeup expertly applied to suggest both vulnerability and determination. She'd always been skilled at crafting the image she needed for any particular audience. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw no trace of the daughter who'd once brought me breakfast in bed on Mother's Day, or cried in my arms after her first heartbreak. The woman staring back at me was a stranger, calculating and cold, already mentally preparing her defense strategy. "Miss Miller," Judge Hendricks addressed me directly, "you're alleging that the property transfer to your daughter was obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation. That's a serious charge. Are you prepared to present evidence supporting this claim?" Patricia stood smoothly, her confidence reassuring in the formal atmosphere. "Yes, Your Honor. We have documentation of the defendant's false statements regarding the nature of the transfer, evidence that she deliberately prevented my client from seeking independent legal counsel, and proof that she concealed material facts about the mortgage obligations." "Ms. Whitfield, how does your client respond to these allegations?" Marcus Whitfield rose with theatrical gravity, adjusting his glasses as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, my client categorically denies any fraudulent conduct. This was a voluntary family arrangement designed to provide stability for Miss Walsh's minor children during a difficult divorce proceeding. The plaintiff's current claims represent buyer's remorse, not fraud." The legal maneuvering continued for an hour, with both sides outlining their positions and presenting preliminary arguments. Judge Hendricks listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed her thorough understanding of property law. When she finally called for a recess, I felt mentally exhausted despite barely speaking. "How do you think it went?" I asked Patricia, as we stood in the courthouse hallway. "Better than expected. Hendricks is fair but tough, and she doesn't tolerate nonsense. The fact that she's allowing discovery to proceed means she thinks we have a legitimate case." Discovery. The word sounded ominous, conjuring images of invasive investigations and uncomfortable deposition. Patricia explained that both sides would now have the right to request documents, conduct interviews, and gather evidence to support their positions. The process could take months, and would likely expose every detail of our family's private business to legal scrutiny. The next several weeks blurred together in a haze of legal meetings, document reviews, and strategic planning sessions. Patricia's office became my second home as we prepared for the extensive discovery process. She'd requested copies of all communications between Meredith and her original attorney, financial records related to the property transfer, and documentation of Meredith's statements about the arrangement. Meredith's legal team responded with their own aggressive discovery requests, demanding access to my financial records, medical history, and correspondence with family members. They were clearly building a case that I was mentally incompetent or emotionally unstable, hoping to undermine my credibility as a witness. "It's a common tactic," Patricia explained when I expressed outrage at the invasive nature of their request. "They're trying to paint you as a confused elderly woman who didn't understand what she was signing. We'll challenge the most unreasonable requests, but be prepared to have your life examined under a microscope." The psychological toll was enormous. Every aspect of my relationship with Meredith was being dissected by strangers, reduced to legal arguments and strategic considerations. The love, trust, and shared history that had once defined our bond became evidence in competing narratives about fraud and family obligation. It was during this emotionally draining period that Jake Hartwell knocked on my door one evening, his expression serious in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Betty, I need to tell you something that might be relevant to your legal case," he said once we were seated in the living room. I wasn't sure whether to get involved, but Maria convinced me it was the right thing to do. He explained that he'd been working in his garden the day Meredith and I had signed the property transfer documents, 6 months earlier. Their cabin was close enough to the lake house that sounds carried clearly across the water, especially when people were speaking loudly or emotionally. "I heard your daughter on the phone that afternoon," Jake said carefully. "She was talking to someone about the legal arrangements, and her side of the conversation was pretty revealing." My heart began racing. "What did you hear?" She said something like, "Don't worry, she'll never figure out what this really means. By the time she realizes what happened, it'll be too late to change anything." Then she laughed and said, "The old lady thinks she's helping me, but really I'm solving all my problems at once." The words hit like physical blows. Jake's testimony would provide crucial evidence of Meredith's intent to deceive me, potentially proving the fraud allegations beyond any doubt. But hearing my daughter's callous dismissal of my intelligence and trust was devastating on a personal level. "Are you willing to testify about what you heard?" I asked, though part of me hoped he'd refuse. "If it helps you get justice, absolutely." "Maria heard some of it too, so you'd have 2 witnesses." I called Patricia immediately, and within hours she was at the lake house taking detailed statements from both Jake and Maria. Their testimony corroborated the pattern of deception we'd been building, providing the smoking gun that could make the difference in court. "This changes everything," Patricia said as she reviewed her notes. "With independent witnesses testifying to your daughter's admissions of intent to deceive, we have a much stronger case for fraud. The defense will have a very difficult time explaining away these statements." But even as I felt relief at the strengthening of our legal position, I was consumed by grief over what Jake's testimony revealed about my daughter's character, the casual cruelty of her words, the pleasure she'd taken in outsmarting her own mother, the complete absence of guilt or remorse. It painted a picture of someone I no longer recognized. The emotional weight of the legal battle was compounded by my complete isolation from my grandsons. Connor and Caleb had been the bright spots in my life for years, their laughter and curiosity bringing joy to even the most ordinary days. Now they were gone, swept away by their mother's vindictive decision to use them as weapons in our dispute. I found myself driving past their new school sometimes, hoping for a glimpse of their faces or the sound of their voices during recess. The rational part of my mind knew this behavior was unhealthy, but the grandmother's heart that missed them desperately couldn't resist these small violations of common sense. It was during one of these pathetic surveillance missions that Caleb spotted me from the playground. His face lit up with the innocent joy of a child who doesn't understand adult complications. And he ran toward the fence, separating us with his arms outstretched. "Grandma Betty. Grandma Betty," he called, his voice carrying across the schoolyard. I wanted to run to him, to scoop him up in my arms and pretend that none of the ugliness between his mother and me had ever happened. Instead, I stayed frozen beside my car, watching as a teacher approached Caleb and gently redirected him away from the fence. The woman glanced in my direction with a mixture of sympathy and concern, clearly aware of the family situation, but unsure how to navigate the complicated dynamics. Connor appeared beside his brother, older and more aware of the tension that surrounded their family. He waved tentatively, his expression uncertain but hopeful. When I waved back, tears streaming down my face, he seemed to understand that something precious had been broken but wasn't beyond repair. The encounter left me shattered for days, questioning whether pursuing justice was worth the emotional cost to innocent children. Dorothy's words echoed in my memory, reminding me that enabling bad behavior didn't actually help anyone, but the intellectual understanding did little to ease the heartache. It was Ruth who finally provided the perspective I needed, calling from Phoenix just when my resolve was weakening most severely. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said without preamble, "and I want to tell you something about our mother that you might not remember." Ruth reminded me of a family story I'd nearly forgotten, about our mother's decision to confront our alcoholic uncle when his drinking began endangering his own children. Despite pressure from family members to keep quiet and maintain peace, our mother had reported the situation to authorities, ultimately leading to intervention and treatment that saved both our uncle and his family. At the time, everyone called her cruel and vindictive. Ruth continued. "They said she was destroying the family over something that wasn't her business. But years later, when Uncle Joe was sober and his kids were thriving, they all thanked her for having the courage to do what needed to be done. You think I'm doing the right thing? I think you're doing the necessary thing. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not. But Meredith needs to face consequences for her actions, and those boys need to see that adults are responsible for their choices." The conversation reminded me that love sometimes required difficult decisions, that protecting people from consequences wasn't the same as protecting them from harm. Meredith's actions had created this crisis, not my response to them. As winter deepened around the lake house, I settled into a routine that balanced legal obligations with personal healing. Mornings were spent reviewing documents with Patricia or attending depositions, where I answered endless questions about my mental state, financial understanding, and relationship with my daughter. Afternoons were devoted to reclaiming my own identity, pursuing interests I'd abandoned during months of household servitude. I started volunteering at the Cedar Falls Library, helping elderly residents navigate computer systems and online resources. The work was rewarding in ways I'd forgotten, providing purpose beyond family obligations and connecting me with people who valued my skills and experience. For the first time in years, I felt useful in ways that had nothing to do with cooking, cleaning, or childcare. The library work also introduced me to Margaret Chen, a retired social worker who'd spent her career dealing with family dysfunction and elder abuse. Our friendship developed gradually over shared lunch breaks and coffee conversations, but her professional insights proved invaluable as I navigated the emotional complexities of my situation. "What you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse," Margaret said one afternoon as we discussed my case over sandwiches in the library break room. "It's more common than people realize, and it often involves family members who justify their actions as necessary or beneficial." She explained patterns she'd observed during her career, ways that adult children gradually gained control over elderly parents' finances and property through manipulation and emotional blackmail. The descriptions were uncomfortably familiar, mapping almost exactly onto my experience with Meredith. "The hardest part for victims is overcoming the guilt," Margaret continued. "They feel like they're betraying family loyalty by protecting themselves. But families are supposed to protect each other, not exploit vulnerabilities." These conversations helped me understand that my situation wasn't unique or shameful, that I was part of a larger pattern affecting thousands of elderly Americans every year. The knowledge was both comforting and disturbing, providing context while highlighting the scope of the problem. Meanwhile, the legal discovery process was revealing new dimensions to Meredith's deception. Patricia had obtained copies of emails between Meredith and her original attorney, communications that clearly showed her intent to structure the property transfer in ways that maximized her benefit while minimizing my protection. One email was particularly damning, Sent 2 weeks before she'd approached me with her tearful plea for help. I need to get control of my mother's lake house without taking on the mortgage liability. She's too trusting to ask the right questions. So we just need to frame this as a simple family transfer. Can you draft documents that accomplish this goal? The attorney's response was equally revealing. I can structure this as a quitclaim deed with warranty provisions that protect your interests while leaving your mother responsible for existing liens. She'll need independent counsel to understand the implications, but if she chooses not to seek advice, that's her decision. Reading these exchanges was like discovering love letters between conspirators plotting my downfall. The casual way they discussed manipulating my trust, the complete absence of concern for my welfare, the calculated nature of their deception. It all painted a picture of premeditated fraud that went far beyond family misunderstanding. This is exactly what we needed, Patricia said, as she reviewed the email evidence. These communications prove intent to defraud beyond any reasonable doubt. The defense won't be able to argue good faith or misunderstanding when we have their own words describing deliberate deception. But even as our legal case strengthened, the emotional cost continued mounting. The local newspaper had picked up the story, and suddenly our private family dispute was public entertainment for strangers who knew nothing about the years of love and sacrifice that had preceded the betrayal. The courthouse reporter had written a sensationalized account that painted me as either a vindictive mother or a helpless victim, depending on which paragraph you read. Shopping in town became an ordeal of whispered conversations and sympathetic looks from people who'd known our family for years. Some offered support and encouragement, sharing their own stories of family conflicts and legal battles. Others seemed to view the entire situation as entertainment, asking probing questions disguised as concern. The worst encounter came at the grocery store, when Ellen Morrison from the church auxiliary cornered me in the produce section. "Betty dear, I'm so sorry to hear about your troubles with Meredith," she said with the false sympathy of someone fishing for gossip. "Everyone's talking about how sad it is when families fall apart like this. Are you sure you're doing the right thing, dragging this through the courts?" The implication was clear. I was the troublemaker, the one disrupting family harmony by refusing to accept my daughter's betrayal gracefully. The suggestion that I should simply absorb the financial and emotional damage for the sake of appearances was infuriating. "Ellen," I said quietly, "if someone stole your house and left you responsible for a $250,000 debt, would you consider that a family disagreement or a crime?" She stammered something about how family situations were always complicated, then hurried away to spread her version of our conversation to whoever would listen. The encounter left me angry but also strangely liberated. I was tired of being polite about my daughter's crimes, tired of pretending that family relationships exempted people from basic moral standards. The preparation for trial consumed the winter months, with endless meetings, document reviews and practice sessions where Patricia grilled me about testimony and cross-examination strategy. She warned me repeatedly that Meredith's attorney would try to portray me as confused, vindictive, or mentally unstable, questioning every aspect of my credibility and competence. "The most important thing is to stay calm and stick to the facts," she coached me during one particularly intense preparation session. "Don't let them bait you into emotional responses or defensive explanations. Answer the questions simply and directly, then stop talking." As the trial date approached, I found myself sleeping poorly and eating little, the stress manifesting in physical symptoms that worried my doctor and concerned my friend. Margaret suggested meditation and relaxation techniques, while Jake and Maria took turns checking on me and ensuring I maintained some semblance of normal routine. The night before trial, I sat alone in Frank's study, surrounded by documents and legal briefs that would determine my future. His presence felt particularly strong in that room, among the books he'd loved and the desk where he'd paid our bills and planned our dreams. I could almost hear his voice offering encouragement and wisdom for the challenges ahead. Outside, snow fell steadily on the lake, covering the landscape in pristine white that masked the complexities beneath. By morning the world would look clean and simple, ready for whatever battles the new day might bring. I only hoped I was equally prepared for the confrontation that would finally determine whether justice or family loyalty would prevail. The courtroom was packed with spectators on the morning of the trial, their faces a mixture of curiosity and anticipation that made my stomach churn with nervous energy. Word had spread throughout Cedar Falls about the family drama unfolding in Judge Hendrick's courtroom, and apparently legal disputes involving property fraud and family betrayal drew quite an audience. I recognized several faces from around town, including Ellen Morrison from the church auxiliary, whose presence felt like salt in an open wound. Patricia had warned me that trials involving family members often attracted attention, but I hadn't been prepared for the circus atmosphere that surrounded our entrance to the courthouse. A local television reporter thrust a microphone toward my face as I climbed the steps, asking how it felt to sue my own daughter. I kept my eyes forward and my mouth closed, following Patricia's advice to avoid any statements that could be twisted or taken out of context. Judge Hendricks called the court to order at precisely 9 o'clock, her stern expression suggesting she was as displeased with the media attention as I was. She began with a warning to the gallery about courtroom decorum, making it clear that any disruptions would result in immediate ejection from the proceedings. "This is a civil matter involving property rights and contractual obligations," she announced, her voice carrying absolute authority. "It is not entertainment, and it will not be treated as such in my courtroom." Meredith sat at the defendant's table, wearing a charcoal gray suit that projected both professional competence and subtle vulnerability. Her makeup was perfectly applied, highlighting the shadows under her eyes that suggested sleepless nights and emotional strain. She'd always been skilled at crafting her public image, and today was clearly no exception. When she caught my eye, her expression mixed hurt and defiance in equal measure, as if I were the one who had betrayed fundamental trust. Patricia rose for her opening statement with confident poise, addressing the jury of 6 citizens, who would ultimately decide my fate. She outlined our case methodically, describing the property transfer as a carefully orchestrated fraud designed to enrich my daughter while leaving me financially devastated. Her voice remained calm and factual as she detailed the evidence we would present, from the incriminating emails to the eyewitness testimony about Meredith's admissions of deliberate deception. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about more than property rights," Patricia concluded. "It's about the fundamental principle that trust between family members cannot be weaponized for financial gain. Mrs. Miller loved her daughter enough to give her everything she asked for. That love was repaid with calculated betrayal designed to strip away her security and independence." Marcus Whitfield's opening statement painted an entirely different picture, portraying Meredith as a desperate mother trying to provide stability for her children during a traumatic divorce. He described me as a lonely widow who had initially welcomed the arrangement, but was now suffering from buyer's remorse and age-related confusion about the legal details. "My client made no false statements and concealed no material facts," he argued with theatrical conviction. "This was a voluntary family arrangement that Mrs. Miller now regrets. Rather than accepting responsibility for her own decisions, she has chosen to destroy her relationship with her daughter and grandchildren through these baseless accusations." The defense strategy was exactly what Patricia had predicted: paint me as either mentally incompetent or vindictively manipulative, while positioning Meredith as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. It was a narrative that would resonate with anyone who'd experienced family conflicts or struggled with aging parents, and I could see several jurors nodding thoughtfully during Whitfield's presentation. Our first witness was Patricia herself, testifying about the mortgage company's discovery of the unauthorized property transfer and the legal implications of leaving me responsible for debt on property I no longer own. She methodically explained the difference between a legitimate family gift and a fraudulent scheme designed to transfer benefits while avoiding obligation. Under cross-examination, Whitfield attempted to portray the mortgage issue as a technical oversight rather than deliberate fraud, suggesting that any competent attorney could have resolved the problems if I had simply sought proper legal counsel initially. Patricia handled his questions with professional composure, repeatedly redirecting attention to the evidence of intentional deception. The second day of testimony featured Jake Hartwell, whose account of overhearing Meredith's phone conversation provided devastating evidence of her intent to deceive me. Jake's background as a retired police officer lent credibility to his testimony, and his straightforward delivery made it difficult for the defense to challenge his recollection or motivation. "I heard her say, and I quote, 'Don't worry, she'll never figure out what this really means,'" Jake testified, his voice steady and clear. Then she laughed and said something about the old lady thinking she was helping when really she was solving all of Meredith's problems at once. Whitfield's cross-examination focused on the distance between Jake's garden and the lake house, questioning whether he could have accurately heard a phone conversation from that far away. But Jake had anticipated this line of attack, explaining how sound carried across water and providing specific details about other conversations he'd overheard over the years. Sound travels differently over water, Jake explained patiently. On a calm day, you can hear normal conversation from surprising distances. Mrs. Walsh wasn't trying to keep her voice down because she thought she was alone. Maria's testimony corroborated her husband's account, adding details about Meredith's triumphant tone and casual dismissal of my intelligence. The defense tried to suggest that the couple had misunderstood innocent comments, but their consistent recollections and lack of apparent bias made their testimony compelling. The introduction of the email evidence on the third day created a palpable shift in courtroom atmosphere. Patricia read selected excerpts aloud, each exchange between Meredith and her attorney, revealing new layers of premeditation and deliberate deception. The jury listened with growing attention as the correspondence painted a clear picture of calculated fraud. One email was particularly damaging, sent from Meredith to her attorney 3 days before she approached me with her tearful plea for help. "I've been thinking about this property transfer idea, and I think it could solve multiple problems simultaneously. If we structure it correctly, I get the house, the boys get stability, and my mother gets to feel useful while actually becoming financially dependent on me. She'll never agree if she understands the real implications, so we need to present this as a simple family arrangement." The attorney's response was equally revealing. "I can draft documents that accomplish your goals, but your mother really should have independent counsel to understand what she's agreeing to. If she chooses not to seek advice, that's her decision, but you need to be careful about how you present the arrangement to avoid allegations of fraud." Meredith's final email in the exchange removed any doubt about her intentions. "Don't worry about her getting independent advice. I know exactly how to present this so she'll sign without asking difficult questions. She trusts me completely, and I intend to use that trust to my advantage." The courtroom was silent as Patricia finished reading, the weight of documented deception hanging heavy in the air. Several jurors were taking notes, their expressions suggesting that Meredith's own words had accomplished what hours of testimony might not have achieved. Whitfield objected repeatedly during the presentation of email evidence, arguing that private communications between attorney and client were being taken out of context and didn't prove fraudulent intent. But Judge Hendricks overruled most of his objections, noting that the communications clearly showed planning and premeditation rather than inadvertent misunderstanding. When I finally took the witness stand on the fourth day, my hands trembled despite weeks of preparation with Patricia. The courtroom felt enormous from this perspective, filled with faces that would judge not just the legal merits of my case, but the fundamental question of whether I deserved sympathy or condemnation for pursuing justice against my own daughter. Patricia's direct examination was gentle but thorough, guiding me through the chronology of events from Meredith's initial request for help through my discovery of the true legal arrangement. I tried to keep my voice steady as I described the emotional manipulation, the gradual erosion of my autonomy, and the devastating realization that my daughter had systematically betrayed my trust. "Miss Miller, when you agreed to transfer the property to your daughter, did you understand that you would remain liable for the mortgage debt?" Patricia asked. "Absolutely not," I replied firmly. "Meredith specifically told me it was just changing names on paper for tax purposes, that nothing else would change." "Did she encourage you to seek independent legal advice?" "She actively discouraged it, saying it would just complicate things unnecessarily and cost money we didn't need to spend." "If you had understood the true legal implications, would you have agreed to the transfer?" "Never. I would have found other ways to help her that didn't destroy my own financial security." The cross-examination was brutal, exactly as Patricia had warned. Whitfield spent hours questioning my mental capacity, my memory of events, and my motivations for pursuing the lawsuit. He suggested that I was a bitter elderly woman who couldn't accept that my adult daughter had successfully moved on with her life. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Miller, that you were lonely after your husband's death, and welcomed the opportunity to live with your daughter and grandchildren?" he asked with patronizing concern. I was grieving my husband's loss, I acknowledged, but I wasn't seeking to become anyone's unpaid housekeeper. You say you became a housekeeper, but isn't it true that you voluntarily took on household responsibilities because you enjoyed caring for your family? Initially, yes, but there's a difference between helping family and being taken advantage of by family. Whitfield's questions grew increasingly aggressive, suggesting that I was mentally confused about the legal arrangements, vindictive about my daughter's success, and manipulative in my portrayal of events. Each accusation felt like a personal attack, designed to undermine not just my credibility but my fundamental character. Mrs. Miller, isn't it true that you're pursuing this lawsuit simply because you can't stand to see your daughter independent and successful? The question hung in the air like an accusation of fundamental maternal failure. For a moment I felt the old impulse to apologize, to smooth over conflict rather than defend myself. Then Frank's letter seemed to whisper in my memory, reminding me that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. Mr. Whitfield, I said quietly, meeting his gaze directly, I want nothing more than to see my daughter succeed, but I won't accept success built on fraud and betrayal. If Meredith needs to destroy my financial security to achieve her goals, then perhaps she needs to examine what success really means. The answer seemed to catch him off guard, and I saw several jurors nodding approving. Patricia later told me it was the moment she knew we had won, though the formal verdict wouldn't come for several more days. Meredith's testimony was the emotional climax of the trial, her performance carefully crafted to evoke sympathy while minimizing responsibility for her actions. She spoke eloquently about the challenges of single motherhood, the trauma of divorce, and her desperate need to provide stability for Connor and Caleb. Tears flowed at strategic moments, particularly when she described the pain of being accused of fraud by her own mother. I love my mother more than anything, she said, her voice breaking with apparent emotion. The idea that she thinks I deliberately deceived her is devastating. Yes, maybe I should have explained the legal details more clearly, but I was overwhelmed and scared and just trying to survive. Under Patricia's cross-examination, however, Meredith's carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. When confronted with her own emails describing her intention to use my mother's trust to my advantage, she claimed the words had been taken out of context. When asked about Jake's testimony regarding her phone conversation, she suggested he had misunderstood innocent comments. Miss Walsh, you wrote to your attorney that your mother would never agree if she understands the real implications of the property transfer. What did you mean by that? Patricia asked with prosecutorial precision. I meant that she might worry unnecessarily about technical details that wouldn't really affect her, Meredith replied, but her voice lacked conviction. You also wrote that you intended to present the arrangement so she would sign without asking difficult questions. Can you explain what you meant by difficult questions? I just meant I wanted to keep things simple and straightforward. Simple and straightforward by concealing information that might have changed her decision. Whitfield's objection was sustained, but the damage was done. Meredith's evasive answers and shifting explanations contrasted sharply with the clear documentation of her premeditated deception. The most devastating moment came when Patricia introduced evidence of Meredith's current financial situation, revealing that she had used the lake house as collateral for a business loan within weeks of gaining ownership. The loan proceeds had funded a luxury lifestyle that included expensive clothes, a new car, and private school tuition for the boys, all while I remained responsible for the original mortgage. Miss Walsh, you obtained a $40,000 line of credit using the lake house as collateral, didn't you? Patricia asked. Yes, but that was for legitimate business expenses, including $8,000 at high-end clothing stores and $12,000 for a luxury vacation to Europe. I needed professional attire for client meetings, and the boys deserved a nice vacation after the trauma of the divorce. All funded by a house you obtained through false statements to your mother, who remains liable for the original mortgage while you enjoy the benefits of ownership. The question hung in the air unanswered, Meredith's silence more damaging than any response could have been. The closing arguments synthesized weeks of testimony into competing narratives about family, trust, and legal responsibility. Patricia's summation was masterful, weaving together the evidence into an irrefutable case for deliberate fraud that had stripped me of my home while enriching my daughter at my expense. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear, she concluded. Meredith Walsh systematically deceived her mother, concealed material facts, and prevented her from seeking independent advice. She then used the property she obtained through fraud as collateral for personal loans, while leaving her mother responsible for the original debt. This isn't family disagreement, it's theft disguised as love. Whitfield's closing argument portrayed Meredith as a victim of circumstances, who had made mistakes but not committed crime. He urged the jury to consider the broader family context and the devastating effect that a fraud verdict would have on innocent children. This family has suffered enough, he pleaded. Don't compound their tragedy by criminalizing a mother's desperate attempt to provide for her children. Miss Miller's buyer's remorse doesn't constitute fraud, regardless of how she chooses to reframe events. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days, their lengthy discussions suggesting careful consideration of the complex evidence and competing narrative. I spent those days in a state of suspended animation, unable to eat or sleep properly while waiting for strangers to determine my future. Patricia tried to reassure me that lengthy deliberations often favored the plaintiff in fraud cases, but the uncertainty was agonizing. When the jury finally returned, their faces revealed nothing about their decision. Judge Hendricks called the court to order with her usual stern authority, and the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict that would reshape my relationship with my daughter forever. In the matter of Miller versus Walsh, we find for the plaintiff on all counts, the foreperson announced. We find that the defendant obtained the property transfer through fraudulent misrepresentation, and award the plaintiff compensatory damages in the amount of the property's current value, plus punitive damages of $50,000. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs and whispered conversations, but I barely heard the noise over the roaring in my ears. We had won. The jury had vindicated my claims, and ordered Meredith to pay me the full value of the property, plus additional damages for her fraudulent conduct. Judge Hendricks ordered the immediate reversal of the property transfer, returning ownership of the lake house to me along with all rights and responsibilities. She also ordered Meredith to vacate the premises within 30 days and to cease any use of the property as loan collateral. As the gavel fell and court was dismissed, I felt a complex mixture of triumph and devastation. Justice had been served, but at the cost of permanently destroying my relationship with my daughter and potentially affecting my access to my grandchildren. The victory felt hollow, even as it provided the vindication I had desperately needed. Meredith left the courtroom without speaking to me, her face a mask of cold fury that promised this legal victory would come at an enormous personal cost. Whitfield was already talking about appeals and post-trial motions, clearly intent on prolonging the battle despite the jury's decisive verdict. The media attention following the verdict was overwhelming, with reporters seeking interviews and legal experts analyzing the case's implications for elder abuse law. I declined all interview requests, wanting nothing more than to return to the sanctuary of my lake house and begin the process of rebuilding my shattered life. The 30-day eviction period passed in tense silence. Meredith returned to collect her belongings while I was away, leaving no note or acknowledgement of the years of love and support that had preceded our legal battle. The boys' rooms were stripped bare, their laughter and energy replaced by an emptiness that seemed to echo through the entire house. Jake and Maria helped me reclaim spaces that had been transformed during Meredith's occupancy, gradually restoring the house to the way Frank and I had maintained it. Each recovered photograph and repositioned piece of furniture felt like a small victory in the larger battle for my identity and independence. The financial settlement took months to resolve, complicated by appeals and post-trial motions that ultimately failed to overturn the jury's verdict. When the final payments were made, I found myself financially secure but emotionally devastated, wealthy in money but impoverished in family relationships. 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected visitor. Connor appeared at my door one afternoon, having somehow convinced someone to drive him the 15 miles from town to the lake house. At 9 years old, he was too young to understand the legal complexities that had torn our family apart, but old enough to know that he missed his grandmother. "Mom says I'm not supposed to talk to you," he confided as we sat on the dock where Frank had taught him to fish. "But I don't understand why. What happened to our family?" The question broke my heart anew, forcing me to find age-appropriate explanations for adult betrayals and legal battle. I tried to help him understand that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt the people they love, and that forgiveness takes time, but isn't impossible. Do you think Mom will ever forgive you? He asked with the directness that only children possess. I don't know, sweetheart, but I hope someday she'll understand that I was trying to protect myself, not hurt her. Connor's visit led to secret meetings with both boys over the following months, carefully orchestrated encounters that violated Meredith's explicit instructions, but provided essential connection to the grandchildren I'd thought I'd lost forever. They were confused by the family dynamics, but adaptable in the way that children manage to be, accepting the new reality while maintaining love for both their mother and grandmother. Through these clandestine visits, I learned that Meredith was struggling financially in the aftermath of the trial. The punitive damages and legal fees had depleted her savings, and her consulting business had suffered from the negative publicity surrounding the fraud conviction. She and the boys were living in a small apartment across town, a dramatic step down from the luxury they'd enjoyed at the lake house. Part of me felt vindicated by her struggles, proof that actions have consequences, and that fraud doesn't pay in the long run, but a larger part felt the persistent ache of maternal love, wanting to help despite everything that had happened between us. The impulse to rescue her was still strong, tempered now by hard-won wisdom about the difference between helping and enabling. It was Margaret Chen who helped me navigate these complex emotions, her professional experience with family dysfunction providing perspective on the healing process. Through our conversations, I began to understand that forgiveness didn't require forgetting, and that protecting myself didn't make me a bad mother. Healthy relationships require mutual respect and reciprocity, she reminded me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. You can love your daughter without accepting abuse from her. In fact, refusing to enable her bad behavior might be the most loving thing you can do. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from Meredith. The envelope was addressed in her familiar handwriting, and I stared at it for hours before finding the courage to open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with the careful script I remembered from her childhood thank you note. Mom, it began. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness after everything I put you through. The trial forced me to confront some ugly truths about myself and the choices I made. I convinced myself that I was a victim of circumstances, but really I was just selfish and scared and willing to hurt you to solve my problems. The letter continued for 2 pages, acknowledging the fraud and expressing genuine remorse for the pain she had caused. She didn't ask for money or make excuses for her behavior. Instead, she took full responsibility for her actions and their consequences, something I had never heard from her before. I understand if you can never forgive me, the letter concluded, but I wanted you to know that losing you was the worst consequence of my choices. The boys miss you terribly, and so do I. If you're ever willing to try rebuilding our relationship, I promise to earn back your trust instead of demanding it. I read the letter dozens of times over the following weeks, analyzing every word for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. But the tone felt different from her previous communications, lacking the calculated appeal to my emotions that had characterized her earlier requests for help. It took me 3 months to respond, time spent in careful consideration of whether reconciliation was possible or advisable. When I finally wrote back, my letter was cautious but hopeful, establishing boundaries while leaving the door open for gradual rebuilding of trust. The reconciliation process was slow and sometimes painful, marked by setbacks and misunderstandings that threatened to derail our progress. Meredith had to learn to respect my boundaries while I struggled to overcome the defensiveness that the trial had created. But gradually, tentatively, we began to rebuild something that might eventually resemble a mother-daughter relationship. The boys were the bridge that made reconciliation possible, their innocent love providing motivation for both of us to overcome our pride and hurt feelings. Sunday dinners at the lake house became a family tradition again, though now they included explicit discussions about expectations and boundaries that would have been unthinkable in our previous dynamic. Meredith never fully recovered financially from the consequences of her fraud, and she never again asked me for money or property. The trial had taught her that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed, and that trust, once broken, required years of consistent behavior to rebuild. As I write this, 5 years have passed since the trial that changed our family forever. The lake house remains my sanctuary, filled now with the laughter of grandchildren who understand that love comes with responsibilities as well as privileges. Meredith and I have found a way to coexist that honors both our need for relationship and my requirement for respect. The legal victory provided more than financial security. It gave me back my sense of self-worth and independence. I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't make you a bad person, and that enabling bad behavior isn't the same as showing love. Most importantly, I discovered that it's never too late to reclaim your life, even when it means making choices that feel impossible. The lake still reflects the changing sky, the loons still call at dawn, and Frank's presence still whispers through the rooms he built with love and hope for our future. But now I know that I am strong enough to protect what we created together, wise enough to demand the respect I deserve, and brave enough to fight for justice, even when it comes at an enormous personal cost. Sometimes love means saying no. Sometimes protecting yourself is the most loving thing you can do. And sometimes the hardest battles are the ones most worth fighting, because they determine not just what you'll have, but who you'll be. The years following our tentative reconciliation brought unexpected challenges that tested the fragile foundation we'd built. Meredith's financial struggles deepened when her consulting business failed completely, leaving her unable to make rent on the small apartment she shared with Connor and Caleb. The boys, now 10 and approaching their teenage years, were acutely aware of their mother's stress and their family's reduced circumstance. It was Connor who brought the situation to my attention during one of our Sunday dinners, his young face creased with worry that no child should have to carry. "Grandma Betty, Mom cries at night sometimes. She thinks we can't hear her, but the walls are really thin in our apartment." The protective instincts that had been dormant since the trial stirred to life, creating an internal conflict between my hard-won boundaries and my desire to help my struggling family. This was exactly the scenario Margaret Chen had warned me about during our ongoing conversations, the test of whether I'd truly learned to distinguish between helping and enabling. "What does your mom cry about?" I asked gently, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Money stuff," Caleb chimed in with the blunt honesty of a child who'd overheard too many adult conversations. "She got a letter from the landlord yesterday, and after she read it she locked herself in the bathroom for like an hour." Eviction. The word hung unspoken in the air between us, but its implications were clear. Meredith was facing homelessness, and by extension, so were my grandsons. The irony wasn't lost on me that 5 years after I'd made her homeless through legal action, circumstances were threatening to repeat the cycle. That evening, after the boys had returned to town with their mother, I found myself pacing the lake house in an agony of indecision. Every maternal instinct screamed at me to open my checkbook and solve their problems, to provide the safety net that grandmothers were supposed to offer. But Frank's letter, now permanently framed on my bedside table, reminded me that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. I called Patricia Kellerman, who had become not just my attorney but a trusted advisor on navigating the complex aftermath of family litigation. She listened without judgment as I outlined my dilemma, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "Betty, what does your gut tell you about Meredith's situation? Do you think this is genuine hardship, or another manipulation designed to access your resources?" The question forced me to examine my daughter's behavior over the past 2 years with clinical objectivity. Since our reconciliation began, Meredith had been scrupulous about respecting boundaries and never asking for financial help. She'd taken responsibility for her actions during the trial, and had worked hard to rebuild trust through consistent behavior rather than empty promises. "I think it's genuine," I admitted. "She's been different since the trial, more honest, more aware of how her actions affect others, but I'm terrified of falling back into old patterns." "Then maybe the answer isn't whether to help, but how to help in a way that maintains your boundaries while addressing their genuine need." Patricia's suggestion led to sleepless nights of planning and soul-searching. By the end of the week, I had developed a proposal that would provide temporary housing for my family while protecting my own interests and maintaining clear expectations about responsibility and reciprocity. I invited Meredith to lunch at the diner in town, neutral territory where we could have a difficult conversation without the emotional weight of family history pressing down on us. She arrived looking tired and defeated, her professional wardrobe replaced by clothes that showed the strain of financial stress. "Meredith, the boys told me about your housing situation," I began without preamble. I want to help, but not in the way I helped before. Her face cycled through emotions: hope, fear, weariness, resignation, as she waited for me to continue. The daughter who had once confidently manipulated my generosity now sat quietly, understanding that any assistance would come with conditions she might not like. I'm offering you and the boys temporary housing in the guest cottage behind the lake house, I continued. 6 months, with the possibility of extension if certain conditions are met. You'll pay utilities and contribute to household expenses according to your means. Most importantly, you'll sign a formal lease agreement that establishes clear boundaries and expectations. The guest cottage had been Frank's workshop and occasional retreat, a small but comfortable space with a bedroom, bathroom, and kitchenette that could house a small family if necessary. We'd always intended it as overflow space for visiting relatives, though it had never been used for that purpose. What kind of conditions? Meredith asked, her voice carefully neutral. I pulled out a typed document I'd spent days crafting with Patricia's legal guidance. First, this is temporary housing only, not a permanent solution. You'll use this time to stabilize your finances and find independent housing. Second, you'll contribute to household maintenance and upkeep according to your ability. Third, any financial assistance will be structured as loans with clear repayment terms, not gifts. Fourth, you'll participate in family counseling to address the underlying issues that led to our previous problem. Meredith read through the document carefully, her expression revealing nothing about her thoughts. When she finished, she set it down and looked directly at me for the first time since entering the diner. Why are you doing this? She asked. After everything that happened, why are you willing to help me again? The question deserved an honest answer, even if the truth was complicated and sometimes contradictory. Because you're my daughter, and Connor and Caleb are my grandson. Because I believe people can change if they want to badly enough, but mostly because I've learned the difference between helping someone and enabling them. This help comes with expectations and accountability. Tears gathered in Meredith's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I don't deserve this kind of generosity from you. You're right, you don't, but they do, I said, nodding toward the window where Connor and Caleb were visible in the parking lot, throwing a baseball back and forth while they waited for their mother. And maybe earning something you don't deserve is how people learn to deserve it. The move into the guest cottage happened gradually over the following month, with clear protocols established for shared spaces and mutual responsibility. I was surprised by how naturally we fell into a routine that respected both our need for family connection and my requirement for personal space and autonomy. Meredith threw herself into the household contribution requirements with an energy that seemed almost desperate to prove her good intentions. She took over the vegetable garden Frank had abandoned years before his death, coaxing tomatoes and peppers from soil that had been neglected too long. She painted the dock railings, repaired screens on the porch, and tackled maintenance projects I'd been putting off since becoming the sole homeowner again. The boys flourished in the lake environment, their stress about housing insecurity replaced by the joy of having access to swimming, fishing, and the kind of outdoor freedom that small apartments couldn't provide. Watching them rediscover their love for the water reminded me of why Frank had chosen this spot for our family retreat decades earlier. Family counseling sessions with Dr. Rachel Morrison were initially awkward and sometimes painful, as we worked through years of resentment, disappointment, and broken trust. Dr. Morrison specialized in families recovering from financial abuse and fraud, and her no-nonsense approach cut through our tendency toward emotional manipulation and defensive justifications. Meredith, you've acknowledged that you committed fraud against your mother, Dr. Morrison said, during one particularly intense session, but acknowledgement isn't the same as taking responsibility. What are you doing to repair the damage you caused? I'm working hard. I'm contributing to the household. I'm following all the rules she set, Meredith replied, her voice defensive despite her obvious efforts to remain calm. Those are compliance behaviors, Dr. Morrison observed. They show respect for your mother's boundaries, which is important, but what are you doing to rebuild the trust you destroyed? How are you addressing the emotional damage you caused? The question hung in the air, forcing both of us to confront the reality that healing required more than good behavior and respectful coexistence. Trust wasn't something that could be earned through chores and rent payments. It required vulnerability, consistency and time. It was during our third month of cohabitation that an unexpected crisis tested our new dynamic. Connor broke his arm during a bicycle accident, requiring emergency surgery and overnight hospitalization. Meredith's anxiety about medical bills and her son's well-being triggered old patterns of panic and emotional overwhelm that I recognized from her divorce period. "I don't have insurance that covers this," she confessed as we sat in the hospital waiting room, her voice shaking with barely controlled terror. "The surgery alone will cost thousands, and if there are complications..." The old me would have immediately offered to pay, writing a check to solve the problem without considering the implications. The new me, shaped by years of hard-won wisdom about boundaries and enabling, recognized this as a crucial test of our revised relationship dynamic. "What are your options?" I asked instead of offering solutions. "Payment plans, maybe. Medical credit cards with horrible interest rates. I could try to negotiate with the billing department." She was thinking out loud, working through possibilities instead of immediately looking to me for rescue. "Those sound like reasonable approaches. What can I do to support you while you handle this?" The shift in my response was subtle but significant. Instead of taking over her problem, I was offering to support her efforts to solve it herself. Meredith seemed to recognize the difference, her panic gradually giving way to focused problem solving. In the end, I did provide financial assistance, but as a formal loan with clear repayment terms rather than a gift that would reinforce dependence. Meredith negotiated successfully with the hospital's financial department, securing a payment plan that made the debt manageable. More importantly, she handled the crisis with competence and maturity that suggested genuine growth. The incident marked a turning point in our relationship. Over the following months, Meredith began approaching me with problems she was working to solve rather than crises she expected me to fix. She asked for advice instead of money, support instead of rescue. The subtle changes in our interactions suggested that the boundaries I'd established were reshaping her expectations and behavior in positive ways. As the 6-month lease period approached its end, we faced the question of whether to extend the arrangement or transition to independent living. Meredith had found part-time work with a local marketing firm and was slowly rebuilding her professional reputation, but her income remained insufficient for quality independent housing in our expensive lakeside community. The decision ultimately came down to whether our revised relationship could sustain longer-term proximity without reverting to old patterns of dysfunction. Morrison's assessment was cautiously optimistic, noting significant improvements in communication and mutual respect, but warning that extended cohabitation carried risks for both of us. "Betty, you've done remarkable work establishing and maintaining boundaries," she observed during our final joint session, "but there's always a risk that familiarity will erode those boundaries over time." "Meredith, you've shown genuine commitment to change, but you're still in recovery from patterns that took years to develop. Extended proximity could test your progress in ways that might be counterproductive." After considerable deliberation, we agreed to extend the cottage arrangement for another 6 months, with modified terms that reflected Meredith's improved financial situation and our increased comfort with the living arrangement. The second lease included higher rent, expanded household responsibilities, and clearer expectations about long-term independence. The decision proved wise. As Meredith's professional situation stabilized and her confidence grew, she began talking seriously about finding permanent housing that would allow her to rebuild her independence while maintaining close family relationships. The cottage had served its purpose as a bridge between crisis and stability, providing security without creating permanent dependence. It was during this transition period that I received an unexpected phone call from Ellen Morrison, the church auxiliary member who had confronted me in the grocery store years earlier during the height of our legal battle. Her voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, as she asked if we could meet for coffee. "Betty, I owe you an apology," she said once we were seated in the diner where Meredith and I had negotiated the cottage arrangement months earlier. "I was wrong about your situation with Meredith. At the time I thought you were being vindictive and destructive, but watching how things have played out, I can see that standing up for yourself was exactly what your family needed." Ellen went on to describe her own struggles with a manipulative adult son who had been financially exploiting her for years. Our legal battle had apparently inspired her to seek counseling and establish boundaries that had ultimately improved her relationship with her son, though the process had been difficult and sometimes painful. I wanted to thank you for showing me that it's possible to love someone without letting them destroy you, she concluded. Your courage gave me permission to protect myself. The conversation was a reminder that our family's public battle had rippled out beyond our immediate circle, affecting other families struggling with similar dynamics. The knowledge that our painful experience might have helped others find their own strength provided unexpected meaning to the suffering we'd endured. As Meredith's second lease period neared its end, she surprised me by announcing that she'd found a house to rent in town, a small but comfortable place where she and the boys could rebuild their independent life while remaining close enough for regular family contact. The transition felt natural and positive, a graduation rather than an abandonment. The day they moved out of the cottage, I stood on the dock watching Connor and Caleb load their belongings into their mother's car. At 12 years old, they were approaching adolescence with the resilience and maturity that children develop when they've weathered family storms and emerged stronger. Their easy affection for both their mother and me suggested that our complicated journey had ultimately created space for healthier relationships. Grandma Betty, Connor said as he prepared to leave, thank you for not giving up on us. I know Mom made mistakes, but she's trying really hard to be better. The simple statement encapsulated everything I'd hoped our healing process might achieve. The boys understood that their mother had made serious errors without losing respect for her efforts to change. They'd learned that forgiveness was possible without forgetting important lessons about trust and responsibility. Meredith's goodbye was more complex, weighted with everything we'd been through and everything we'd learned about each other. Mom, I know I can never fully repay what I stole from you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Not just the money in the house, but the trust and the peace of mind. But I promise I'll spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in my ability to change wasn't misplaced. Watching their car disappear down the driveway, I felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with legal victories or financial settlement. The real triumph was standing on my own property, in the house Frank and I had built together, surrounded by evidence of a family that had been broken but not destroyed, damaged but ultimately healed. The lake house felt different now, charged with new memories and possibilities rather than haunted by betrayals and disappointments. The guest cottage stood ready for future visitors, but no longer represented a refuge for family members fleeing the consequences of their choices. It was simply space for connection and support, available when needed, but not required for anyone's survival. That evening, I called Ruth in Phoenix to share the news of Meredith's move and our family's continued progress. My sister listened with the satisfaction of someone who'd watched a difficult situation resolve through patience and wisdom, rather than quick fixes and emotional reactions. You know what I'm proudest of, Ruth said as our conversation drew to a close. You didn't rescue them, and you didn't abandon them. You found a way to help that actually helped, instead of just making everyone feel better temporarily. Her words captured the essence of what I'd learned through years of legal battles, family counseling and painful growth. Real love sometimes required saying no to requests that seemed reasonable on the surface. Real help sometimes meant allowing people to struggle with problems they'd created for themselves. Real healing sometimes demanded boundaries that felt harsh but ultimately proved necessary. As I settled into my evening routine in the quiet house, I reflected on the journey that had transformed me from an enabling victim into a woman capable of protecting herself while maintaining her capacity for love and forgiveness. The legal victory had been important, but the personal growth had been essential. I'd learned that it was never too late to reclaim your life, never too late to demand respect, and never too late to model healthy relationships for the next generation. The loons called across the water as darkness settled over the lake, their voices wild and free and utterly themselves. I understood that feeling now, the peace that comes from living authentically within boundaries you've chosen and defended. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight I was exactly where I belonged, in a home I'd fought to keep, surrounded by love I'd learned to protect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.